For all my love of monster games, none captured my love and interest more than the Monster Rancher series of games. However, for as much as I praise them, I am always met with the same question. Snek, how on earth do I play these games? The in-game tutorials aren't stupendously helpful. Most guides online are either useless or extremely meta methods, which demand you follow only, quote-unquote, the best raising methods, mandating specific actions each in-game week. Plus, the threat of a monster's limited lifespan combined with complex and ill-understood mechanics. Where does one begin? If you're watching this video right now, you've already taken your first steps. Welcome, everyone. I am the Hipster Snek, and this is Snek's Guide to Monster Rancher. I feel it important to clarify that this guide is specifically aimed at Monster Rancher titles wherein you actually ranch monsters. Games like Monster Rancher Explorer or Battle Card are not going to be covered. Those are all great games, but we're here to cover the actual ranching titles. This first episode will be a broad overview of Monster Ranchers 1 and 2, as they are very mechanically similar, and the things that we cover here will be applicable to both unless I make a very specific aside. Videos for other installments, including 4, the advanced titles, and DS will be released later, as their mechanics are substantially different enough from the above. And I'm never playing Monster Rancher 3 again, thank you kindly. Now, with that disclaimer out of the way, let us begin. I see you too are a gamer of supreme taste and wish to enter into the world of monster breeding. I certainly don't blame you. There's supreme wealth to accumulate from the sport of monster battle, lost knowledge to find in expeditions, worldwide fame, and much more awaiting those who take that plunge. But where to start? Well, first, you'll be prompted to introduce yourself and meet your assistant. They will be in charge of routine maintenance around your ranch and giving you weekly updates on your monster's current overall condition. Ah, but you don't have a monster yet, do you? That will be the second step, picking out your partner. Luckily, we have some options, the market and the shrine. The market is home to a merchant who will hand us one of 3 monsters completely free of charge. In Monster Rancher 1, these will always be Tiger, Suezo, and Dino. Whereas in Monster Rancher 2, you will always have access to Mochi and Zoom, the breed that replaced Dino in Monster Rancher 2 going forward, and a third seasonal rotating option between Suezo, Kaboo, Arrowhead, and Hare. Now, it's important to not confuse free with cheap. Monsters from the market are every bit as good as monsters you'll unlock from discs, even if they do somewhat lack the mystique. As an aside, the market will offer to buy monsters back from you. Never, ever take them up on this terrible offer. The price of a monster hinges on how much they've grown since generation, and that will always be a paltry sum compared to what a well-trained monster can get you elsewhere. And for those who want a more hands-on approach to monster generation, you'll be pleasantly surprised by just how entertaining the shrine itself can be. At the shrine in Monster Ranchers 1 and 2, you'll be given a prompt to remove the game disc and insert another in its place. There, the game reads the inserted disc's Q code, a sort of table of contents for CD-ROMs technically speaking, and when the original disc is set back in place, it will then generate a monster based on the information it read, and some in-game algorithms that, at present, are ill understood. But it's worth mentioning that even if the same breed of monster is created from 2 different discs, their starting stats and attacks can and often will be different between their iterations. Either way you do it, shrine or market, you'll get your monster. If you're unhappy with your selection, you are free to decline the critter and try again to your heart's content. What monster should you try to raise, or which one is the best? While there are factors that may seem to influence you towards one build or another, you should do what you find fun. The best monster is just the monster you like best. Let no one dissuade you. Pick them out, name them with love, and begin at the ranch, the first week of April in the year 1000, ready to begin careers as monster breeders in earnest. The first thing we'll do, the action first taken in each in-game month, is choosing what to feed our monster. In Monster Rancher 1, these options are fairly cut and dry, limited to just potatoes, fish, and meat. Monster Rancher 2, meanwhile, adds the options of milk, cup, jelly, and tablets, but some of the same basic rules still apply here. First and foremost, do not feed your monster potatoes. Yes, they're cheap, but these worthless food items actually raise your monster's fatigue and stress levels, even if they're listed as your monster's favorite item, a mechanic I will cover later on. If money is an issue, give your monster fish. Or if the monster is fairly young and you're playing Monster Rancher 2, milk is a cheap and useful substitute. Some guides you'll find online think they're very clever and helpful by suggesting ways you can skip out on feeding your monster. They are dumb and wrong, and you absolutely should never listen to this advice. Feeding is actually an important chance to both help reduce stress and fatigue by giving them a filling meal, but also bonding with your monster by giving them food items they prefer. It will also make the monster happier, raising loyalty however slightly. When you have the opportunity to do so, you should invest in more expensive foodstuffs like meat and tablets. These may encourage a monster to pack on some pounds, but you can work that off with steady exercise. I'll cover weight more here in a minute. As an aside, it should be mentioned that the only way to get a true game over in these titles is to queue up the feeding event having less than 10 gold on hand and no items to sell. Suffice it to say, this exists as more of an Easter egg and should never actually happen during meaningful gameplay hours. Anyway, now that your monster has a full stomach, it's time to begin training. While the names change between the titles, the 10 training types available to you will remain the same between each of these two games. The only difference is, in the first game, training doubled as a day job you rented your monster out to, and so it will bring home some pocket change worth of gold each time. This was essentially to make sure that the less frugal ranchers among us wouldn't immediately break the bank. But when it comes to training, where does one begin? Well, let's open up our monster stat page and have a look at what the monster excels at. It shouldn't be difficult to figure out. Even baby monsters will show proclivities for certain stats and not others. There are 6 stats total: life, power, defense, skill, speed, and intelligence. While we're at the stat screen, we should also have a quick look at the monster's attacks and get familiar with what all these screens really tell us. Life is your monster's hit points. It's as simple as that. It has no influence on lifespan. It does, however, from Monster Rancher 2 going forward, influence how long your monster can stay out while it's on an expedition. Power is the attack stat that strengthens the physical, or yellow, attacks. It also serves to reduce incoming physical damage as well, but should be considered an offensive trait 99.9% of the time. During expedition, power will also be used to remove obstacles that require brute force, like breaking a boulder or moving a toppled pillar off the road. Defense is obvious. It reduces all incoming damage the higher it is. That's really all there is to it. Skill is a little ambiguous in terms of its name, but you can think of it as your accuracy stat. Later games end up calling it that anyway. I've been told that it also influences item gathering and expeditions, but I haven't seen this proven just yet. Speed is an equally obvious defensive-oriented stat. The higher it is, the harder it is for an enemy to hit your monster. Speedy monsters will dodge attacks rather than attempt to mitigate any incoming damage. And intelligence is the attack stat that will strengthen mental, or green, attacks. And like its counterpart power, passively reduces incoming intelligence-based damage as well. Also, it is required to overcome some expedition obstacles that are intelligence-based, and also said to influence item gather rates as well. As my best expedition monsters do tend to be high intelligence, I am much more inclined to believe this one. Now, all 6 of these stats sound important, and to a greater or lesser extent they are. However, an invisible stat, lifespan, is also at play. As I already implied a few times, a monster, much like any other living thing, lives and will eventually die at the cruel whims of passing time. And like any other living thing, monsters will go through growing phases, and each pass through these different phases, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and twilight, at slightly different rates. Going into each of these individually would be overwhelming and not terribly helpful, but that's why we have our assistants to give us reports on when a monster has entered a new growth phase of their lives. That's why we have them to give us help after all. What does that mean for you as the rancher? Simply put, it means time is precious, and that you should prioritize what stats you want to emphasize on your monster starting fairly early on in their lives. If you're unsure what that monster should do, have them do a few training sessions and see which of their stats grows the quickest. This usually works as a decent enough litmus test. If you're still not sure or the numbers are too close to call, guess. I know that doesn't sound like the best advice, but trial and error can teach you a great deal about your monster and their individual preferences. These things will become more obvious with time. Remember, you should always prioritize at least one attack stat, that being power or intelligence, 1 defense stat, defense or speed, and always, always, always emphasize skill. Winning with low skill is essentially a game of luck and save scumming, and generally I find it an unpleasant experience at best. Once they start getting to the tail end of infancy, you can then send them to Errantry, a somewhat luck-based endeavor to gain greater stat growth and possibly even learn new attacks. But don't rush to this. It's expensive for starters. And besides, the infancy is best spent bonding with the monster more than necessarily the stat growth they'll achieve in that time. How do we do that? Well, as they're training, a young, inexperienced monster is bound to make mistakes. Failure of the training, incomplete training, and maybe even cheating or abdicating of the training if they're in a particularly foul mood, are all grounds to scold your monster. Also, certain items like Scorpion Dust, an item name that makes bile rise to the back of my throat, can be used to rein in willful monsters as well. Spare the rod, spoil the suezo. However, that doesn't mean you should be abusive towards your monster either. Sometimes, letting a monster off the hook can be a great relief to them. And, better yet, sometimes the monster will excel at their training and eventually will go on to win tournaments in your ranch's name. This is grounds to praise the monster. You see, loyalty, conveniently always listed on the HUD and monster stats, is measured by 2 means: how much they love you and how much they respect you. Thus, spoiled monsters who become lazy or Spartan monsters who know only discipline will rarely spike above 50 loyalty. The monster's overall training style is listed on their stat sheet, and generally speaking I try to keep it to normal, or 1 step in either direction of it. As an aside, in Monster Rancher 2, some items can also be listed as liked or disliked items under your monster's status screen. These items will be given a bonus to their effect. Like if a monster has a favorite food, for instance, the amount of stress and fatigue that reduces when consumed will be increased. But if they dislike it, a negative value is applied instead, reducing the efficacy of positive items or enhancing the impact of negative ones. Oh, speaking of food, a monster's weight does have a mechanical effect, but it may not be the one you might expect. A fat monster will fatigue faster, and they actually gain a bonus to defense while they're in battle, but they'll also suffer a penalty when trying to dodge. Meanwhile, a skinny monster will accumulate stress at an accelerated rate, but they'll gain a bonus to dodging, all the while suffering penalties to their defense. Weight does not actually impact a monster's lifespan for good or for ill, so don't hesitate to plump up your golems or keep your hairs on the slim side, depending somewhat on how you build their stats. Speaking of, remember, taking breaks is a part of working. Between all that training, your monster will build up fatigue and stress. A good week's rest will greatly reduce these factors and make your monster ready for whatever comes next. Because once we have the stats, it's time to really bust some stress by way of busting heads at a monster battle. And no, that's not a joke. Battles are actually one of the best ways to reduce monster stress, even if it does raise fatigue. The other option is Mintleys, which are a 50% flat reduction value. Anyway, the battles begin ranked at E, subsequently rising ever towards A and eventually the coveted S rank. There are regular tournaments, which often have larger cash payouts and sometimes offer items both rare and mundane, and official tournaments. Official cups have lower gold rewards, but will rank your monster up to the next difficulty level. It's actually a good idea to participate in regular tournaments first, and the reasoning for this is twofold. For starters, it will help you gauge your strengths and weaknesses and what you need to look out for. Plus, it's good practice. You see, once you enter a battle, the controls will take some getting used to. Even between Monster Ranchers 1 and 2, some of the nuances will change, particularly in how you change and launch your attacks. Secondly, the game will ask if you want to give orders to your monster or let them make decisions for themselves, effectively fighting automatically. Never pick that latter option, the AI is frankly quite terrible. Anyway, once you're in the battle, pay close attention to the stat marked as Will or Guts. There's something you can only learn once you've entered the fray. To start, this is your battle energy. It will begin at 50 and will tick upward whenever you're not launching attacks, and is paid out in order to execute said attacks when you give the command to do so. Higher Guts also will raise your accuracy ever so slightly, but let's not get too technical here. The important thing to keep in mind is that Guts regeneration is species-specific, and this will help dictate the pace of your battles. Coupled with the nature of your monster's attacks, this will change significantly how you play your battles out. This is all on an individual basis, and you'll need to learn to adapt to your monster's playstyle as you go. These complex mechanical considerations aside, doing regular battles, in addition to funding your ranch operations and getting you extra items, has another and very important long-term goal: psychological warfare. Enemy monsters who you have battled and beaten in the past, particularly those who suffered knockouts at your hands, will be wary to engage in battle with you again, oftentimes opting of the fight entirely and forfeiting the match to you without contest. While the games do have a check to ensure that you'll fight at least one enemy per tournament, it is an amusing and, frankly, empowering feeling to watch the masses quake before your monster's awesome might. Some tournaments are even required to unlock additional monster breeds, but I'll cover those in future installments so we don't get too technical here. Ultimately, you'll want to fight your way to the top of every rank, eventually progressing to the S rank in the last 4 tournaments of the game. The final goal? The Monster Hall of Fame, where your critter will be immortalized as monster legend for all time. But don't think that's all there is to do. There's more than just crushing your enemies underfoot. Karn, the zany Dr. Eggman-looking fellow, will stop by 3 times a year once your ranch and monster are past a certain rank, to take you on expeditions. I really don't want to spoil too much, as there's tons of awesome things to find while you're on expeditions. Some of the rarest items, several hidden locked monster breeds, some of the game's very well hidden lore and trivia, are all hiding in these challenging and interesting maps, where your monster's stats are going to be repurposed for entirely new tasks. As I teased previously, you'll use your attack stats to remove obstacles, your HP for their longevity, excepting Monster Rancher 1 where it's time-based, and more as you poke around the frozen tundras, the scorching deserts, and the lush humid jungles far away from civilization. And lastly, must come the end of the monster's life. Parting is always sweet sorrow, but take heart, ranchers. The end of the monster's life is not the end of the monster or their legacy. When your assistant advises that it's time to retire the monster, finish whatever you had on their plate as soon as you can, and then take them to the monster lab in town. There, monsters can be cryogenically frozen and stored as long as is required. Don't worry, this process does not harm the monster at all. In fact, you can thaw and freeze them an unlimited number of times to no ill effect. However, more important than that is 2 frozen monsters can undergo a new method of monster generation: monster fusion. I'm not going to get too overly technical on this part, as fusion is ill understood as mechanics go. But once you have 2 frozen monsters, you can then proceed to fuse them together. This will result in a new baby monster, and if you raised both monsters with love and care as you should, you will notice that the resulting offspring will have markedly higher stats and possibly even more attacks than its parents did when they were first born. This is, however, a little different whenever you use a fusion item, some of which guarantee a particular result from the fusion. Those baby monsters will have set stats and attacks whenever the item is used. If you're trying to get a particular result in the first game, also remember the particular week you're trying to do the fusion in does mess with the results for reasons that aren't completely clear. With a new monster born from your hard work, you're ready to start anew with a big leg up on the competition. And from here, you can only improve. Don't get discouraged because you have a few monsters who plateau at the C or B ranks. That's perfectly normal, and monsters like that can end up being big fundraisers for a young ranch, a golden opportunity in disguise, if you will. Remember that as you gain more items and expand your ranch and your capacities, you'll also grow as a rancher in your own right. You'll begin identifying monsters and their strengths and weaknesses on sight, or planning new strategies by raising monsters that you hadn't before. You'll learn what genomes result in strong combinations of monsters, and the value of items like taffy and mint leaves to help maintain the monster's stress and fatigue. Always strive to keep growing and keep experimenting. Try something you've never done before, or change the methods you use to raise the monster week to week. The most important piece of advice I can give you is never stop trying. I didn't even have an instruction booklet when I first started playing the game. Play the game, discover your own style. That is how you will excel as a rancher in Monster Rancher 1 and 2. Did I cover everything you were dying to know? If this guide left you satisfied and ready to raise some monsters, leave a like down below. For future installments of this series, maybe consider hitting the subscribe and bell icons too. All of that will go a long way in helping the channel grow. Did I miss something you wanted to know more about? Leave a comment below and I'll get back to you as best I can. For more direct access, an entire list of social media from me and the Tomodachi Bros is listed in the video description below. Join me next time as we'll take a look at Monster Rancher 4 and how you can become a monster breeder in a whole new system and set of mechanics. And I'll see you there.